pleased to see such a nice crowd. I think some of you may have to stand because we're limited on chairs, but hopefully that will be all right. I'm Phil Bricker, the chair of the philosophy department, and this is our third edition, if you will, of the Matthews Lecture. Postponed 1 year because of the pandemic, like many things were. Normally it's every 2 years. This lecture honors my former colleague, our former colleague in philosophy, Gary Matthews, who died in 2011. His main interests were ancient philosophy, and also was a pioneer in developing philosophy for children and going into public schools to teach philosophy. But he strongly, applied his ethical values to peace and social justice and was an activist in a lot of such issues. And we've therefore taken to try to invite speakers who we think will follow those interests of him as well, so as today's speaker will. Without further ado, I'm going to have Louise Antony, who organized all of the events surrounding this, introduce our speaker, and I want to thank Louise for all the work she's done.
Well, I would also like to thank my colleagues, our office manager and office assistant, Beth Grubko and Christine Melander, for all the clerical and logistical work that they did, my colleagues for being supportive of this effort, and the people at the university who have been very, very helpful in getting all of this arranged. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Massachusetts Amherst acknowledges that it was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norituck community. We also want to acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Amherst is a land-grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Act, portions of land from 84 native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jason Stanley, the Jacob Urofsky Professor of Philosophy at Yale University. Noam Chomsky recently gave an interview to the online magazine Truth Out. It was about the social responsibility of intellectuals. He writes, "The term intellectual is used usually to refer to a category of people with a degree of privilege who are somehow regarded to be the guardians of society's intellectual and moral values. They are supposed to uphold and articulate these values and call upon others to adhere to them. Within this category," I apologize, I get out of breath very easily with this mask on. "Within this category," Chomsky continues, "there's a small minority who challenge power, authority, and receive doctrine. The task of a responsible person, anyone who wants to uphold intellectual and moral values, is not to speak what they regard as truth to anybody, the powerful or the powerless, but rather to speak with the powerless and to try to learn the truth. That's always a collective endeavor, and wisdom and understanding need not come from any particular turf." Jason Stanley is, get so out of breath. Jason Stanley is one of the small minority of intellectuals who engage with public issues. Professor Stanley's areas of expertise are philosophy of language and philosophy of mind. And in myriad ways, he has brought the insights of philosophy and the learning that he has accrued to topical issues, important issues of the day. Most recently, he's been writing about propaganda, what it is, how it works, and also fascism, and how we need to see connections among authoritarian movements around the world. Jason has published in all sorts of general interest magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Boston Review, the Washington Post, Die Zeit, Aeon Magazine, the Boston Globe, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He's appeared on numerous television and radio shows, podcasts, including Democracy Now!, and he's been a guest in a number of occasions of National Public Radio, All Things Considered, and other programs. He has published and lectured in Ireland, Germany, Italy, and throughout he is making important and non-obvious connections between intellectual issues and the issues that consume us today. It's not that he has neglected his academic work or his scholarship. During the same period of time, he has published, I got tired of counting, at least 5 books, including the book How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, which is available for sale at the Amherst book table there. Also a work, How Propaganda Works, is a book that I'm using in my own course in the philosophy of language. And then the books Know-How, Knowledge and Practical Interests in Language and Context. His most recent work is still in progress, in production, co-authored with David Beaver. It's called The Politics of Language, an essay in non-ideal theory. His topic today is fascism as a social kind. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Jason Stanley.
As usual, I'm wishing my mother were here to hear that. But thank you. Louise Anthony and Joe Levine are 2 intellectuals who have been my models. And Gary Matthews as well, to whom we're here memorializing. So this paper is written with the philosopher Susanna Siegel, because I often do philosophy, as my friends know, by talking. So we were complaining about discussing the issue of how to distinguish the structure of what we're seeing now across the world, including in the United States, and whether fascism, as I argued in my 2018 book, was an apropos way of dividing reality, of carving up social reality. There have been a lot of criticisms, what's now called the fascism debate or the fascism analogy. Is it right? Is it alarmist? Is it politically useful to use the term fascism? Is it, as my colleague Sam Moyne argued in several pieces starting in the New York Review of Books, is it really liberals who raise alarms about fascism in order to restore a status quo? So that's a concern about the use of the fascism terminology to describe movements. I'm going to be discussing less that and more just, is it accurate? Do we need it? Are there other words or concepts that do this work for us? And here, Professor Siegel and I argue the answer is no, but we're also going to elucidate the concept of fascism by contrast with these other concepts. So so I'm going to do a mixture, like I do lately when I run, of walking and running, of reading and talking, since there's a lot to get through. So one time a dinner guest asked our 10-year-old, what do you think of communism? And he said, well, you know, it sounds great in practice, in principle, but like it could never possibly work. It's just too idealistic. You know, it's like democracy. Democracy is an ideal. But it's an ideal that many societies have had. It's fashionable to say it wasn't really there as an ideal until the 18th, 19th century, until the Enlightenment. But I think in the book Age of the Republic, Plato rightly characterizes the ideals of democracy, freedom, which leads, as he warns, to equality. And the idea of consent and self-governance are ideals that exist in a variety of different material circumstances and time. Now, what about other concepts like fascism or socialism? Well, so Leopold Senghor, in The African Road to Socialism, attempted a definition. Says, okay, well, socialism doesn't really apply to Africa because he says there was no division of labor. I think he's wrong, but he was arguing the material conditions in Africa are different, so you need to characterize socialism at a broader level and have an African definition of socialism. It doesn't require European material conditions. And he says dialectical materialism, that's just something that happens in Europe. So what about fascism? Is fascism just a name for Italy and Germany in the middle, in the mid-20th century? Or is fascism a concept that has broader applicability like democracy? So that's the question we're going to address. Now, some people some scholars of fascism, like Roger Griffin, who's certainly an eminent scholar of fascism, takes publicized orchestrations of mass death to be essential to fascism. Now, if you did this, Nazi Germany in 1935 would not be fascist. So I don't think you should do this. A lot of Nazi Germany, we often do this guess where, we ask students how many people were in concentration camps, and I forget exactly the year, 1937 or whatever, 20,000, a small group. So, but it's still a fascist regime, even though it's well before mass genocidal death. So someone like Breivik connects fascism to, he says, well, Anders Breivik is a fascist. Anders Breivik said of himself that he was a fascist, as did the New Zealand mosque killer, mass murderer. But I don't think you want to do this because neither by this criterion, neither Germany in the 1930s nor Italy under Mussolini would be fascist. So how would we understand fascism, and how would we characterize it so it's something that has broad applicability and is a useful and important concept? So in history and political and social philosophy, there's apparently Timothy Snyder told me, Tony Judd, you said, well, fascism is boring because it's just like we're the master race. Communism, it's more interesting. You read Hegel, it was more, you had to go to more classes. So that will emerge in my description of fascism. So what we're going to argue for the centrality of fascism to multiple disciplines. And such a rescue, in fact, constitutes a return to my discipline of philosophy, as some of the greatest theorists of fascism, such as Theodor Adorno and Hannah Arendt, were in fact philosophers. I just love walking through the campus Du Bois library. I just spent ages in it, and all the Du Bois references and quotes and everything. You guys are very lucky. And Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, in I forget which chapter, towards the beginning, he says, talks about how beautiful the United States was and how much, the rivers and streams, and then God leaned over and dropped a black man into the world, and fascism broke out. So, fascism, yeah. Now, it's to argue that fascism has significance and centrality for political philosophy. You don't need to show that it's a universal possibility throughout history. So I think nationalism, some kind of nationalism, is essential for fascism, and that's not uniformly throughout history. So what I'm going to do in what follows is articulate the concept of fascism by contrasting it with four other concepts that are also used to describe contemporary far-right movements, leaders, and parties. So those concepts are authoritarianism, demagoguery, or sometimes populism, but the word populism is used in too many different senses. So we'll make authoritarianism, demagoguery, ethno-nationalism, and then finally neoliberalism, which is not itself something, a word you use to describe far-right movements, but is more like an obstacle to democracy. And so by sort of comparing and contrasting fascism to these concepts, we can get a better understanding of it, and we can see why it is a good description of what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in India, social and political movements really happening all over the world right now. So I want to begin by focusing on sort of a characteristic error. I better keep track of the time. Oh, good. So a characteristic error that one could make of thinking that fascism is only a regime, or, you know, I mean, there are fascist regimes, and there's a topic, what is a fascist regime? And that's a great topic to discuss. But fascism, you can talk about fascism in a number of different ways. So in Toni Morrison's 1995 commencement address to Howard University, entitled Racism and Fascism, she speaks of the United States as a country that has too many forces interested in fascist solutions to national problems. So she's not talking about a fascist regime, she's talking about a fascist solution to a national problem. Then she talks about, and when she describes these solutions, and this is Toni Morrison's analysis of fascism is enormously impactful on me, here's what she says. 1, construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion. 2, isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and coded name-calling and verbal abuse. Employ ad hominem attacks as legitimate charges against that enemy. Enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonizing process because it's profitable, because it grants power, and because it works. Palisade all art forms, monitor, discredit, or expel those that challenge or destabilize processes of demonization and deification. Subvert and malign all representatives of and sympathizers with his constructed enemy. Solicit from the enemy collaborators who can agree with and can sanitize the dispossession process. Pathologize the enemy in scholarly and popular mediums. Recycle scientific racism and myths of racial superiority in order to naturalize the pathology. Criminalize the enemy, then prepare, budget for, and rationalize the building of holding arenas for the enemy, especially its males and absolutely its children. Reward mindlessness and apathy with monumentalized entertainments. So this is what she's calling, what Morrison is describing here is a political culture. It's a political culture. It's a political culture based around a kind of interpersonal domination of an anti-people. So these anti-people can be trans, they can be minority, they can be, but an anti-people who themselves can't be subject to, who themselves, and then you have these narratives about the anti-people that structure fascist culture, which I'm going to talk about, of course, in great detail. So the anti-people, the anti-people are characterized in these contradictory ways. They're lazy, but they're working really hard to steal from you. They're lazy, but they're really intense at banking, and that's how, like, their criminal enterprises are varied and profound. They have incredibly intricate plots to get your women, like the Hindu love jihad in the Muslim love jihad in India, where they say Muslims are trying to get Hindu women by convincing them they love them and marrying them, and then they become Muslim. So, so there's this anti-people that's crucial to fascism. The anti-people can be they're usually racially or religiously characterized, but they can be characterized in terms of occupations. Okay, so what you can have this political culture even with a regime that is not itself an authoritarian regime. This is a political culture. It's a political culture, however, that is going to be that creates a kind of what Viktor Frankl called a dual state. where the people have one rules and the anti-people, there's another set of rules for them. So now, in saying that this concept, the concept of fascism I'm going to develop and illuminate, we're going to develop and illuminate in this paper, is useful as a social kind. We're not saying, people always would say to me, you're saying this is fascism, so then there should be this, this, and this. That's not the claim. The claim is not that you can predict the order of events in which they occur. Rather that there's a bunch of events that co-occur at different times and mutually support each other. And so that's why scholars of fascism were able to say, that's why Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Timothy Snyder, me, although I got some cowardice, cold feet, like in December or something. But because I mean, that's why scholars of fascism were able to say, there's a coup happening. You know, because you could predict the structure. Like, that's why it's not necessarily that you could also just watch a Donald Trump rally and he would have told you that there was, but he's remarkably transparent. So the predictive, I can give 100 examples of where fascist practices happened, but in different orders in different countries. So you could do mass killings of drug addicts like Duterte in the Philippines and then take away press freedoms. So if you look at Duterte, what you have to think is that if that's fascism, the anti-people are the drug dealers, the thousands and thousands and thousands of people killed as drug dealers. You don't have to treat them with any kind of justice. There's another sphere of law that applies to them, or non-law. There's a lawlessness that applies to them. So, but after that, he brought in press. After that, he attacked the press. He restricted press freedoms. He first did mass killings. But you can see why a leader who does mass killings is going to have to crack down on the press, right? Because you better not have those reported, and then you better not have the more complex story told that really they weren't drug dealers, they were just people, or really they were like just, who cares if they were drug dealers? I mean, sorry, you don't gun down people, and they had family, they were humans who were deserving of, but you don't want that reported in the press, so you have to crack down on the press. So generally, there's a kind of structure. And this is the structure I describe in detail in my book, How Fascism Works. It embraces hypernationalism, xenophobia, or virulent racism to draw support for a leader with authoritarian tendencies. The leader cultivates and claims to enjoy a special relationship with his followers and conceives of the polity he leads or aspires to lead as having a uniform ethnic or religious core. Language is also very important here, which, someone like Kimberly Crenshaw is always recognized in her work. The country is portrayed as having undergone international humiliation as a consequence of the embrace of liberalism in the form of human rights law or international treatises. Liberal elites are said to have weakened the immigration laws, threatening to allow immigrants from targeted religions or despised minority groups to pour in and ruin the country. Marxism, socialism, and gender ideology are supposedly spread in universities and schools and are presented as mortal threats to the nation. So those of you who read Timothy Snyder's amazing New York Times piece on memory laws, where he showed how the anti-critical race theory laws mirror the laws in Eastern Europe, that there are laws in Russia that forbid you from making comparisons between Soviet crimes and Nazi crimes. Poland, you can't talk about Polish concentration camps. You can't talk about Polish complicity. They're meant to be memory laws to shape what kinds of memories you can have. So the military and paramilitary or militarized police forces are treated as institutions whose ideals of explicit domination should be emulated and whose leaders should have political power. Surrounding yourself by generals. When in power, the movement tries to create a one-party state, demanding loyalty to that party over the multi-party nature of a liberal democratic state. And the arrival of this political culture is heralded by a noticeable decrease in the political importance of truth. Something like that is the structure we're trying to describe. So, so many, many examples. The BJP in India. Their CAA laws look to be modeled, as I've argued and others, on the Nuremberg laws. Making citizenship connect to national identity, Hindu identity. So other countries in which we find these tactics include Hungary, Poland, Russia, Spain, the Vox Party, France, India, Israel, Brazil, Italy, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, the United States, and I could go on. Sweden. So let's compare this structure. Let's begin by comparing this structure with one word that's often used to compare, authoritarianism. What's the relationship between this and authoritarianism? And this is important when you're thinking historically about the philosophers that came before us who reflected on this topic. The F scale in Adorno and co-author's book, The Authoritarian Personality. Why is the F there? The F stands for fascism, the fascism scale. It's supposed to measure fascism. But there was pressure to put communism and fascism, because of the Cold War, to not speak that way, to focus on communism as well. So this became the study of authoritarianism. And I actually think the result of as we'll discuss in the next section on right-wing authoritarianism, the social psychology scales that arose from that era and are bequeathed to current study do measure authoritarianism, not fascism. They measure a genus, not the kind. But fascism is a specific kind of authoritarianism, and you should know what kind you're dealing with. And I'm not making a ranking of authoritarianisms, for goodness sake. Stalin's, killed, don't do that. So how do you, so Arendt, whose birthday I believe it is that right? I just got a text saying happy birthday, Hannah Arendt. So from Susanna Siegel, so if that's right, so Arendt in Origins of Totalitarianism has a too simplistic characterization of the relationship between Nazism and Stalinism. She says Stalinism, both are organized on one principle. Nazism is based on the principle of racial supremacy. And Stalinism is based on the one principle of class conflict. And it's just like you replace race by class. I think that's just wrong. I think they're just fundamentally different structures. And that's just way too simplistic. So here are some of the ways in which communist authoritarianism differs from fascist authoritarianism. So they're very different kinds of politics. So they appeal to reason in very different ways. Fascist authoritarianism appeals to a kind of personalism. It's a politics of will. There's a sort of radical equality, rationalist equality behind communist authoritarianism. It's no surprise that communism gets adherents involved in social justice struggles all around the world. It's part of its structural ideals. Nevertheless, Mao, I think Stalin was just a butchering madman, but Mao, who's also, Muslim, but these are rationalist philosophies that say, as many people, we're going to kill a lot of people, millions of people now, to improve society later. We'll get there. We'll get to this equality, this vision of equality, and they historically appeal to universal norms of reason. By contrast, fascism involves a kind of macho strutting, a derogation of reason, a kind of politics of personal domination. The fascist ideologue is a man of action. So you have this again and again, even in fascist intellectuals like Gentile. So the fascist mode of authoritarianism can be found at a smaller scale, in the figures of an overseer of chattel slaves, or a guard in a prison guided by principles of alienation. But it's this explicit domination. So as Ida B. Wells warned when documenting extra-legal lynchings during the backlash against Reconstruction, A concession of the right to lynch a man for a certain crime concedes the right to lynch any person for any crime. So this kind of lawless willfulness that if you're among the people, you can do any, the structure of law, the state of exception is permanent. The state of exception is permanent. If you think about China, one of the damages to the United States really during COVID was the greater efficiency of the Chinese authoritarian handling of the COVID pandemic. So there's a kind of rational, you don't have the same chaotic. It's a kind of rationalist planned authoritarianism, and fascism is not like that. Although when Germans do it, there's lots of planning involved too. So the two visions have different temporal structures. Fascism looks back to the past. It says, in the past we were great. In the past we were great, and we were robbed of this greatness. Communist authoritarianism looks to the future. It says, we're going to sacrifice now for this equal utopia where no one is dominated. In the future, no one will be dominated. The fascist future, everyone will, but the master race will be dominated. So what happens with fascism is we look at it through the lens of rationalist politics. We're like, what's going on? We say things like, how can they say one thing on Monday and then the opposite thing on Tuesday? There's no coherent story, and that's because it's about domination. It's about showing that you can. Okay, so that's an example of how how you can predict the predictive value of this concept of fascism, because you can say, look, when say Trump or Bolsonaro is lying, they're getting away with it. They're not. They're not being caught. Like, lying is good for them because they're owning the libs. And that's how fascism, the affective structure of this politics is getting pleasure at your own, getting pleasure at owning the libs is a good way to put it. Sadopopulism, Timothy Snyder calls it, feeling that at least you're dominating the others. So what about personalist authority and patriarchy? What about just strongmen? Is fascism the same as just strongmen? Certainly, a lot of many but not all of the fascists seem characteristic strong. Mussolini, right, is characteristic personalist strongman. And Ruth Ben-Ghiat, in her brilliant book Strongman, argues for a kind of personalist, Gaddafi, Chavez she includes, who I wouldn't include as a fascist, but he is a personalist strongman in her sense. So now, what I don't think that is the same as fascism, but you could see why a personalist strongman would be attracted to the politics of will. And it's no surprise that the topics of patriarchy and the topics of fascism have always been linked together. Now what about authoritarianism in psychology, the study of right-wing authoritarianism? Is that the study of fascism? Is that the right-wing authoritarian category in social psychology? And no, it isn't, because that actually does not distinguish between fascist and rationalist modes of authoritarian politics. So kind of the attraction to the Chinese Communist Party might be, I think the Chinese Communist Party with the Uyghur Muslims is undertaking a genocidal action that is, that is fascist in nature and probably comes from. So all of these regimes have authoritarianism. They can be mixed, of course. But attraction to authoritarianism, right-wing authoritarianism measures attraction to authoritarianism, like not wanting to rock the boat. They've got the guns, you just don't want to rock the boat. That, that doesn't measure whether you're going to be susceptible to a fascist demagogue or you'll be susceptible to law and order politics, but you'll also be susceptible to any kind of authoritarianism. So Now, let me just check the time. Okay, good. So let me do, so authoritarianism, so there are forms of authoritarianism that don't require an anti-people, and and have as ideals not domination over the anti-people, but radical equality. So, here's the next concept I want to look at. I'm going to have to skip some stuff because demagoguery. This is Eric Posner's term for this concept. You know, when a demagogue, a populist, as it's often called, someone who runs for office attacking the elites. You know, you might say Bernie Sanders. You know, I think it's a reductio ad absurdum of the view that would, you know, I mean, Bernie Sanders is not by any means should be grouped with Bolsonaro or something like that. So, but I think like people who defend this concept, like Jan Werner Müller at Princeton, will say populism means you know there's people you're attacking who are not part of the people, and so Posner in particular says demagogues attack the elites. And it is certainly part of fascism that they attack the elites. That's why, as Hannah Arendt says in Origins, the fascist leader has to be vulgar because people get pleasure out of the idea that the elites will have to bow and scrape to someone they regard as vulgar. So, fascism does involve this attack on elites. There's a punching up to fascism, just like there's a punching up to demagoguery. So Posner says, demagoguery is like it's the people against the elites. So, if you think about it, demagoguery is a two-place relationship between the people and the elites. In fascism, fascist politics involves a three-place relation. That's how you know it's a philosophy talk. It's got the elites, the people, and the anti-people. Huey Long didn't have the anti-people. You know, a demagogue doesn't have, demagoguery is not, you don't have an anti-people, you're just attacking the elites. Fascism involves, you know, both crushing the elites and the anti-people, who should be dominated. So, okay, and secondly, less centrally, demagogues typically attack the political and economic elite. They don't as much go after the cultural elite, the artists, the producers of literature. Fascists always target the cultural elite. Fascists always connect them with, you know, for Hitler, they were controlled by the Jews. In my study and struggles in Vienna, chapter 2 of Mein Kampf. One time I was teaching Mein Kampf in my big lecture, Propaganda, Ideology, and Democracy, and it was Parents' Weekend, or Parents' Week. Like, you know, and you've got to make it plausible, so, all right, don't put me on the chair, but the people were shocked. You heard at Yale, we don't teach controversial things. But yeah, so, but it's important to read Mein Kampf, to inform yourself that these narratives are things you hear. Okay. So what about ethno-nationalism and white supremacy? So people are always asking me, isn't it just white supremacy? And certainly race is central to German fascism. So Du Bois, in The Collapse of Europe, writes, Nazism and slavery in the Americas were both based on an ideology of white masters of the world. And Du Bois concurs with Césaire's analysis and discourse on colonialism, that fascism is what happens when you bring colonialism, racial domination, into your own country and dominate your fellow whites. You know, as famously as Césaire says, Hitler's not the worst person on earth because of what he did, which had been done to tens of millions of Africans, but of who he did it to. So, however, right. And another source of the idea that fascism is essentially white supremacy draws on the inspiration Hitler found in race laws in the United States. So So my colleague James Whitman, in his book, Hitler's American Model, The United States and the Making of a Nazi Race Law, writes, John C. Calhoun, a man who was the subject of a laudatory Nazi biography in 1935, described the basic strategy in 1821. Race slavery, he said, was necessary because it is, quote, the best guarantee to equality among the whites. It produces an unvarying level of them. It not only does not excite, but does not even admit of inequalities by which one white man could domineer over another. Nazi politics, too, was a kind of attempt to unify all all Aryans under the same category and oppose them to the lower races, the Jews and others. And of course, as Whitman famously demonstrated, in detail, I won't go through all of these, Nazi policymakers based their policy on Jim Crow laws, including the Nuremberg laws. So you might think, oh, it's just white nationalism. However, you see this structure between people who are not white. Like, look at India. So India is now in a situation where it's Hindus oppressing Muslims, but no one is white in that scenario. Similarly, you can think of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which Du Bois, perhaps because of his, or no doubt because of his belief that racial domination had to be involved in such horrors, did not fully see the brutality of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, of China. So it's important to see, what's happening in Israel today. With it's not clear that race is the relevant issue there. It's not. And then Duterte, if you think of drug dealers as the anti-people, rather than race, you'd see that as racial ideology. White supremacy does not seem. It seems to be a version of fascism. But fascism is distinct from that. Okay, so, wait, good. For 5-10 more minutes? Yeah, okay, great. So what about nationalism? Well, fascist nationalism has a particular form. Nationalism is okay. It's think of like if you're Polish nationalists and you think there were some people speaking Polish over there, and they had sheep, and some people speaking Polish up there, and they had fish. Cool, let's be Polish. That's fine. But we are the greatest people on earth, and we once dominated, and our domination has been destroyed and removed from us. That's the fascist national myth. We were great, we deserve to rule. And that has been stolen from us. Just an anecdote, because that's also how I think. I was once giving a talk in Kiev. I was speaking to all of the members of parliament, and I was talking about exactly this. The Ukrainian parliament, members of parliament, and I was talking about, well, Ukrainian nationalism is fine. You don't think that you're the greatest people on earth. You want to be apart from Russia and distinct from Russia, but you don't think of yourself as like the greatest people on earth. And then a member of parliament raised his hand in the question session and said, what evidence do you have that Ukrainians are not the greatest people on earth? And then I'm like stumbling, and I was like, well, and another person's like, your President Obama constantly is, even all of your politicians are saying the Americans are the greatest people on earth. And then another one was like, have you heard of Vladimir Klitschko? That's the mayor of Kiev and perhaps the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time, who also has a PhD. And his brother Vasily Klitschko was also the boxing world champion, both of them. So anyway, there's a lot of so there's a kind of fascist nationalism that involves, we were great, and that's a distinctive kind of nationalism. But, and more importantly, I think, well, that's very important, that there's okay nationalisms and there's sort of militaristic nationalisms. anti-colonial movements can also be ethno-nationalist. So that's an important point. In Fanon's On Violence, he's very clear about that, and he talks about, well, I'll get to Fanon in a minute, but the nationalist and anti-colonial movements, nationalist movements can actually unify and eliminate regionalism. Because they can say, look, we're all parts of the same. That's what Fichte was doing in the face of Napoleon, you know, and he was unifying Germany across Bavarians and Prussians. So nationalism can have this function of unifying people who are different, you know. So nationalism can have, and what you're seeing now in the controversies on campus, and those of you who wear them will know what I mean with Hindutva ideology, Hindu nationalism that has moved strongly onto into the, you know, complexities in the United States. You're seeing that Hindu nationalists will often defend themselves by saying, you know, you white people aren't going to push us around anymore with your human rights talk or whatever. And so that will then be like this anti-colonial move that they'll make to defend dispossessing Muslims or giving them second-class citizenship. But the key difference between anti-colonial movements, even though, I mean, Marcus Garvey in 1937, the black nationalist, did say about Mussolini, we were the first fascists. We had disciplined men, women, and children in training for the liberation of Africa. The black masses saw that in this extreme nationalism lay their only hope. Mussolini copied fascism from me. So, but the difference is fascism is ethno-nationalism of the dominant group, not of the minority group. And Fanon is very clear about this. Fanon says the nationalist parties have to act entirely differently once they gain power. They can't act that way anymore. They have to change their culture and ethics. So, okay. Finally, I want to end with neoliberalism. So, a sort of neoliberalist, a sort of global neoliberalist, what Slobodian in his book Globalists calls ordo-globalism. And the idea here is that there should be a multinational capitalist structure that enables fortunes and governments to grow. And in order for multinational companies to be competitive, in order for billionaires to be competitive, they can't be held down by local country structures and can't be hostage to these rules. That's how they would talk, right? We can't, you know, I'm Mark Zuckerberg. I can't, you know, you ask me to do what Germany tells me to do, really? I'm Mark Zuckerberg. So this creates what, again, Ernst Frankl, sorry, I called him Viktor Frankl, wrong. Ernst Frankl called the dual state. So where you have one set of rules for everyone who lives in countries, and then another set of rules for like the multinational corporations, the billionaire class. So you're going to get two overlapping features of fascist culture here. First, you're going to get a kind of loyalty between members of the in-group, the wealthy class, and business districts. So in the very earliest literature on fascism, they described, you know, Arendt, throughout the Frankfurt School, they said, fascism, the fascist leader is like a kind of mob boss. So somebody who seems like a mob boss runs a kind of criminal organization. This is a very old analogy between the fascist leader and the mob boss. And here, too, you see with neoliberalism the idea that some lawless, essentially lawless mega-rich will be able to float free of any consequences. And so you can see the analogies here. Patronage, concepts like patronage, loyalty, kickbacks, loyalty to the leader, are central to the fascist structure. And secrecy, you know, that, you know, the lack of transparency about secrecy, unaccountability is a hallmark of fascist politics. And then there Hitler, in his speech to the Dusseldorf Industrial Club, this is discussed at length in chapter 10 of How Fascism Works, tells the gathered industrialists, you don't want a democracy when you're running your businesses like little fascist empires. You want, because a democracy, people might vote and tell you what to do. You want a system where there's another leader who runs things, and you got to be loyal to that leader, and that's how it works in your business, right? If you bring in democracy, people might want to democratize the workplace. And that's why Jane Addams and Du Bois both put democratizing the workplace as one of the fundamental things you have to do to gain a democracy. So Hitler was right on that. So those are some differences. Those are some similarities. But there's lots of differences. The structure, the one treats people as commodities and objectifies that way. It doesn't have the same kind of people anti-people distinction. Also, fascism involves countries, power coming to countries, which are obstacles to the global capitalist. So there's a kind of difference in priorities where you're thinking of people as labor. And you could actually see, there's a brilliant book by Alexo Golfopoulos, Golfo Alexopoulos, that we just taught in the seminar I'm teaching with Timothy Snyder, where we compare, we called mass incarceration in the United States and the Soviet Union. And Golfo Alexopoulos, illness and Stalin's, and death in Stalin's gulag, or something like that. Each chapter is the official language of the topic of the chapter, but you can't figure out what the topic of the chapter is until you read it, because the official language is so misleading. So the chapter on death is called Labor Laws. And what Alexopoulos is saying, she's giving a Marxist criticism of the gulag. She's saying they thought of people as consumption, as labor. So that's how the sort of globalist way of thinking, this sort of neoliberal way of thinking of things would be, versus sort of fascist domination. Okay, so my goal has been to argue that there's a kind of structure to the far-right movements we see now. There's no surprise that they're linked. And if we think of this as connected to something like prediction, we can predict in the future that these movements will lead to harshly anti-democratic consequences, and down the road, as climate change gets worse, possibly much more severe ones as well. Thank you.
I have a big smile. There will be time for questions and answers, but let me...
I don't know if there'll be time for answers. There'll be time for questions.
Can I just,
Yeah.
So let me just mention that there's another opportunity for you to talk informally with Jason. There's going to be an event Saturday morning, co-sponsored by the Philosophy Department and Massachusetts Peace Action. That's going to be at, as I said, 10 a.m. Saturday morning. It's going to be at the Media Education Foundation Community Room, which is a room behind the Woodstar Cafe in Northampton. That's, I think, it's 60 Masonic Street. See me if you didn't get to write that down and you want to do that. That's going to be just an open-ended question and answer session. You can ask Jason anything, and he will respond. So that is a possibility. For questions and answers right now at this event, I'm going to ask people to come up to the microphone. That's partly to make sure everyone can hear the question, but also because we are recording this and we need you to be on the mic in order for the question to make it into the recording. There is, as I mentioned earlier, there's a book table that has been set up from Amherst Books, our local independently owned bookstore. So I encourage you to patronize that institution. Jason's book, How Fascism Works, is there now. There was a delay in the shipment of How Propaganda Works. Jason's, the other way around? Oh, propaganda's there, fascism's not there. So there's propaganda and not fascism. But
100% of the proceeds from my How Propaganda Works book go to the Prison Policy Initiative. So you're not donating to my parents' kids' college education.
did everybody get that? 100% of the proceeds are going to the, what Jason said, sorry? Prison Policy Initiative. There also will be a reception after the question and answer period, so you're invited to stay for that. So let me open the floor for questions, and the only constraint is to please put your question in the form of a question. So who would like to start? So the line will just take care of itself.
Hi, thanks for coming. I really appreciated your talk.
Thank you.
I love propaganda. I'm really interested in it. And I was curious, if there were like an Olympics of propagandists, who do you think would win the gold medal? Who's the best propagandist?
Well,
Thank you.
I mean, think of marketing. So it's a hard question to ask because there are many languages in which propaganda, the same word is for advertising and propaganda. And, you know, people think of Walter Lippmann, who was one of the main propagandists in, you know, people who helped get us into World War I, as, you know, father of public relations, where that includes both political propaganda and advertising. So since I think of advertising as really a kind of propaganda, I think probably somebody who works for Nike or Fox or Facebook or something, whoever put Mark Zuckerberg in those turtlenecks, I don't know. But yeah, so, and I think it's important to think of marketing. Toni Morrison in Racism and Fascism says that, that fascism involves a kind of marketing. So, you know, and I think one of the things that's very hard to measure quantitatively, the effects of propaganda, it works also with background ideology. So you have, for your propaganda to be effective, you have to be in the right situation. So it's not like a magical thing. I mean, it is true that Frank Luntz's deep sea energy exploration is a very good way to talk about oil rigs. But, you know, yeah, so I mean, I could go through many examples and do in that book of effective propaganda. Luntz also wrote the Israel Report, where he said, where he recommended that, that I talk about this in How Propaganda Works. The Israeli government officials talk to American opinion elites by saying, our greatest the main rule is show empathy for the Palestinians. So that our greatest, he says, he recommends the sentence, our greatest hope for the Palestinians will be that they one day have a leadership that represents their interests. And he says, what you do with this sentence is you undercut the Palestinian leadership and represent yourself as the one who cares about the Palestinians. So from deep sea, he also came up with death tax, but it's unclear how much, it's controversial, like what the underlying, whether that itself did the causal work. But that's just one example. I mean, there are so many propagandists because there's so much television. Whoever's like doing this stuff in the things my kids watch is an excellent propagandist.
If you have a question, you can go ahead and form a queue, try to maintain social distance or physical distance, social connection, physical distance.
Hello, and thank you for coming to give this talk.
Thank you.
I noticed that you mentioned at one point there's an interaction between Hindutva and Hindu supremacy in India and how it's beginning to form in the US. Would you mind giving a bit more historical context about what's been happening with that?
Yes. So what's been happening is that people critical of the Citizenship Amendment Act have been, such as me, but our students as well, and professors. There's a professor at Rutgers who is targeted like this. Who've been critical of what's happening in India, the loss of the democracy in India, loss of India's democracy, have been targeted for Hindu phobia. And so the idea is that they're really anti-Hindu when they're saying these. So we have a student at Rutgers who organized the at Yale. I was at Rutgers for a decade, and so we have a student at Yale who ran an organization called Students Against Hindutva Ideology, and she was doxxed and all sorts of intense threats. And every once in a while, when I give a talk, Hindu nationalists will target me for Hindutva. You'll be targeted for. This is happening not just with India. Let's be clear, with a number of countries. But they'll focus on. I mean, look at Canary Mission for critiques of Israel. But in the last couple of years, I think that universities have faced this issue when someone criticizes Modi, suddenly there's a pile-on, lots of letters to the administration. You've got Hindu phobia. And so it has to be, and they use the language of social justice in order to do this. So it's something that I once was one of like 4 or 5 people who protested Paul Kagame when he came to Yale. We were like standing, like 4 or 5 of us, Rwanda's dictatorial president, leader, and his guys were like, went up to my face and took my picture like that, right, with their phones right in my face. And he said during his talk, we won't let the West criticize us because they would have let all the Tutsis be killed. And Kagame was quite heroic in fighting the Hutu nationalists, Hutu power movement. But he's run it as a dictatorship, and he's justifying it by this anti-colonial terminology. So we're seeing this. We're seeing this with Hindu nationalism and Modi's government being defended on campus.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
So earlier you made this, you brought up this distinction between communism and fascism, where fascism looks to the past to emulate and communism looks to the future. But I thought that like Marxism traditionally alludes back to like a state of nature where, before the division of labor and alienation, people lived in harmony. So I was wondering whether you think that that's less or more important in, communist or Marxist thought than the fascist emulation of the past.
I guess I would say less important because it's the world we're going to build together with technology does the work for us, and we can hang out and chill and be communists together, which would be great, except that the profits are not supposed to go to the people who build the machines who take your jobs away. But so I think there's much more of a we're going to sacrifice to get to some place not yet achieved. We can use the state of nature to draw on that, but it's not the model. I mean, you have to say with fascism too, as Jeffrey Herf points out, it's a revolutionary model. It's a what's his phrase? Reactionary modernism, because fascism too embraces technology, missiles, rockets. It's a reactionary modernism, but communism is not a reactionary. It doesn't seek to return us. It seeks to free us from the problems caused by capitalism, but it's a hitherto unknown future of where equality gets realized. That's what I would say. But,
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. In your earlier discussion of demagoguery, you were careful to distinguish between demagoguery and fascism. The vehicle for doing that is to make this distinction between the elites that are the target of demagoguery per se versus the unpeople, anti-people that are the targets of fascism. And I simply wanted to kind of ask you to perhaps speak a bit more to that distinction, particularly when it seems like when right-wing demagoguery takes place, the elites that are being targeted are often treated, spoken of, as unpeople, distinguished from, say, real Americans or real members of this national group or so on. And oftentimes, too, the unpeople, the individuals that are kind of more clearly fit this definition of an unpeople, are also kind of characterized as being elites. That, you know, yeah.
Right. So with anti-Semitism, that's true. I would say with racism, less so. Anti-black racism in the United States. But with regard to the first point, think of re-education camps. Re-education camps make sense with communist idea, with certain kinds of ways of thinking of, if you think of re-education camp as like, that shows that they're not ultimately anti-people, like, because you can re-educate them. But fascism simply wants to dominate and kill the anti-people.
Hi, thanks for coming today. I just have a kind of like a couple questions. I was wondering, like, what do you think is the future of the GOP and the future of fascism in this country? So what do you think of the GOP downplaying January 6th? And where do you see the anti-democratic movements going in this country? And also, sorry, I know this is a lot. I feel like this is a person that's very pertinent to fascism in America. Could you offer a word on, like, Tucker Carlson, fascism, and propaganda, fear-mongering, you know, racism, that sort of stuff?
Yes. So, great questions. Yeah. So I think you know, you have a long. One of the things that I think that Trump is right about is he points to these fascist aspects of things we've been doing, the invasion of Iraq, the torturing. He's like, we're not good. You know, look at torture. You know, we're not. He's not denouncing torture. He's denouncing the idea that the United States should be good. He's like, why don't we just face what we are, and which is a wild way of looking at things. So I think what we have in the unfortunately is we have an enormous anti-democratic movement taking over the GOP. That is where there's absolutely no. It's just like it's power or nothing, and you know they've changed the electoral laws in many states so that alternate set of electors could be sent. They've done all the things to plug up what happened in 2020 when very right-wing Republicans committed to the rule of law, like in Georgia, refused to overturn the vote. So that's what they're focusing on. Steve Bannon has been talking about, you know, replacing precinct-level officials by loyalists. They've replaced all the secretaries of state. Everyone up. I mean, this is what's wild. Ted Cruz. I'm a man of the people. I went to SUNY Stony Brook. I'm Ted Cruz's age. He went to Princeton, then Harvard Law School. Yeah, I mean, these are the elites of my age, and they're fully down with authoritarianism. So, you know, no one's playing anymore. It's not. It's quite obvious. The Supreme. I mean, you know, we were talking last night. I mean, I think Bush v. Gore was the Supreme Court, as my colleague Sam Moynihan always says, is a highly anti-democratic institution. The Republicans were right about that. And so we have to, so we face all, but you know, these structures, the anti-democratic structures that are enabling an authoritarian takeover here are part of our Constitution. So we've got the Senate, we've got the Supreme Court, you know, we've got these anti-democratic institutions. And so, you know, we need to move the country very quickly towards more of a democracy. And, you know, that doesn't mean that the good things will win out, like in India. You know, a majority of people swung around to Hindu nationalism and against their fellow citizens of Muslim faith. But that, and there's where your Tucker Carlson question comes in. Tucker Carlson is practicing fascist politics. He's, you know, the anti-people, the immigrants. He talks about purity all the time. Fascism as an ethic of purity. So he's always, you know, he's talking white replacement theory, which is, you know, very explicitly Mein Kampf, you know. So, you know, that's what it's all, and it's and it's the original, the idea is Jews want to bring, I mean, the old structure of the, say, Second Klan was Jews want to bring immigrants into, and Jews want to get black people to rise up to create a race war so that they can take over. So yeah, I don't know, those are the things we face.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Some of them.
Thank you for your talk. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more. I know you mentioned the connection between fascism and neoliberalism, but this idea of state domination of markets and plus oligarchy through promoting entrepreneurial industrialists seems to be something along in autocratic regimes as well. Is there something that you might say more about dimensions of an economic system or something like that which are unique to fascist states and not just...
No, I think fascism is a political culture that can survive in different kinds of economic conditions. So you adverted to one definition of fascism as corporatism, the state corporatism, the controlled businesses. But I'm thinking of I think like you look at countries where I mean, you can have more authentic national socialism than, you get countries like Chile being hyper-libertarian and fascist and throwing communists out of helicopters and alleged communists out of helicopters and terrible political violence, but libertarians. But you can also have, I mean, what's happening in Modi, I don't think India is anything like libertarian, and there isn't like a big, that's not underlying what's happening in India right now. So what we tried to do is characterize fascism as a culture independently of that, and then end by talking about these connections between why you would get finance capitalism needing fascism as an ally.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you. You've given us some nice criteria for distinguishing fascism, and one might think, well, ethno-nationalism, for example, is pretty bad too. Why do we care so much about fascism? Why does that matter? And so I'm wondering if, on your account, there's some special harm that fascism can perpetrate or some special threat that it poses.
Great, because I think that fascism has this collection, has this structure like spokes in a wheel, although I'm not that mechanically inclined, so maybe that's not what a wheel has, I don't know. But where you can predict one from the other, you can predict lots of things are going to happen together. And I don't think you can necessarily predict that with ethno-nationalism. I think you can have, black nationalism is not going to break out against mass violence. Okay, there's Liberia, there's the colonization of Liberia by the Tubmans, essentially, but I don't think generally, and there's Zionism, ethno-nationalist versions of Zionism. I mean, there are socialist versions of Zionism, but there were ethno-nationalist versions. Which did end up in mass violence, do end up in domination. But I think that you can have ethno-nationalist movements of minority groups that don't end up there. There's going to be a lot of overlapping features, but I think fascism, when it's an ethno-nationalism of the majority group, essentially, with this structure, you can make predictions. So that's why. And I think the ethno-nationalism shares a lot of the worrisome predictions. I agree. Yeah. But it can also, be, you might use it to unify disparate groups in a country and say, we're all part of the same nation, even though we might have different religions or something like that.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. I have a question about the discussion of the distinction between neoliberalism and fascism that happened at the end, and I took the idea to be something like, well, in fascism we have this people, anti-people distinction, which we need not have in neoliberalism. And I just imagined... Well,
that was demagoguery, but right. But right, that's also true about neoliberalism. Like neoliberalism, but are you going to say the wealthy are the people and the everyone else is the anti-people?
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering, not because I want to argue for this myself, just I'm curious what the response would be, of how you can commodify without creating like an anti-people class. So it's
Right.
I can imagine someone saying like, well, in neoliberalism, there's a group of people who are commodified. And what it is to commodify someone is to fail to treat them like a person.
Right.
So
great,
doesn't
great,
that,
great.
yeah, so I was just wondering how you respond to
I mean,
that.
I think, so, yeah, you're thinking, and it's certainly the case that you commodify that. We just taught the horrifying Tadeusz Borowski here in our Auschwitz set of short stories. And it's certainly the case that they thought of victims as commodities, gold teeth, et cetera, removing, fertilizer. So that's certainly the case. I think that there's a sort of shared lack of intrinsic value to human life in both ideologies. But the importance of domination, of the people dominating the anti-people, the structure of connection between the more powerful, like fascism involves unifying poor members of like poor whites with wealthy whites by saying you're all white. That's different from the structure of this mass wealth oligarchy. Where you're not even seeking to unify. You can see that the oligarchs will want fascism because they won't want people to get mad at them. So they'll want, that's Du Bois's analysis in Black Reconstruction of the use of race in the United States. So you can see why it's going to be useful for them, fascism. But they're not going to need a racial anti-people.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hey, Amelia.
Hi. You mentioned the importance of teaching and reading Mein Kampf, which is something I fully agree with. Reading it was a formative intellectual experience for me. Another formative intellectual experience was reading the Turner Diaries because I wanted to understand American white supremacy. So I just wanted to ask you to recommend a third thing to read.
Guillaume Fay's 2001 Why We Fight.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. You'll recognize too much of it from someone who self-described as, did he ever explicitly self-describe as a fascist? I don't know. He's a European white supremacist, so I would recommend that. It's certainly helped me a lot. The first beginning is called a metapolitical dictionary, and it's about like how you ought to use words. He recommends calling anti-racism the real racism. I don't know if you've heard that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Earlier, I think you said fascism does not tend to use a rational lens, but instead it values domination.
Yeah.
So how can people who are not rational be communicated with, and how can such a fascist political culture be overcome?
Great. So tomorrow's lecture to linguistics and philosophy, to be communicated with. So what I've done in my work, this book I've been writing for 6 years with the linguist and cognitive scientist David Beaver, is trying to rethink speech so that we can see that, communication is not so central. It's more like bonding, creating friend-enemy distinctions, creating social groups and social identity. And that's what you see. And that's why, people say one thing one day, another thing another day, because that's really not really the point. There's all these other points of speaking. And so now how can you get through to fascists? That's a great question. What was the second question?
The second question was how can fascists...
Oh, right, it was how to get through.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, one of the criticisms I get is that I don't have a good answer to this. And people say that's reactionary. You can't be, here's the big problem. And they say that's just adding to the problem. But I think, it's clearly correct. This is what I say in How Fascism Works. Unions are always anti. You can tell fascism from how it, I think there's some old solutions like unions. All fascists always go after unions. You both see Du Bois and Hannah Arendt talking about the importance of unions. Hitler's obsessed with labor unions, as like the enemy. So unions bring people together for materialist politics. So that's one thing. So reminding people that everyone likes the weekend. The weekend's pretty cool. Who doesn't like the weekend? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, bringing people together across bonds that regardless of gender identity or race or language, those tasks, community organizing, building communities, working together across difference are vital in fighting fascism. Supporting journalism, looking at corruption, because all these people are massively corrupt. Or Bond, massively corrupt. His son-in-law is like a pipe fitter, but it's $100 million at least from state contracts. And, so corruption, you need journalism, and not letting, and you ultimately have to roll back the fascist solutions to national problems, the fascist structures like the prisons, the police, which have operated in a way that has reinforced and kept alive the fascist narratives. So Hannah Arendt talks about how fascism involves creating the conditions that makes your politics effective. So you immiserate Jews and send them diseased and dirty and hungry across borders. And you say, see, Jews are dirty, diseased, and hungry. No, Foucault talks about illegality, making people so poor that they have to do something illegal, like there has to be an illegal economy. Then you bust them and you say, that's not a revolutionary, that's a criminal. So try to address things like over-policing, incarceration, worker injustice, and then you reduce the need for fascism.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the talk. You sort of answered my question some. I'm just curious because you were distinguishing fascism from these other things like neoliberalism, and I'm curious about how you think they're connected. You've kind of answered this. I mean, the sort of the neoliberalism thing and the elites and everything, there's tremendous disparities. They've increased, so the labor unions don't have the kind of strength they do anymore. And just like, yeah, so just how is it?
And so then you need fascist solutions.
Yeah, exactly. So
you create an illegal economy to criminalize those who rebel, massive prisons, you get people, you split up the poor people. You tell one group of poor people, no, you're on top. You tell the other group of poor people, no, they just get harsh justice. And then you remove the conditions for cooperative, for solidarity. So they'll need, and it helps if you, I think this is the point of one of the previous questions. If you want to treat people as anti-people, as consumer, as sort of just mere consumption, it helps to view them as anti-people.
right. Okay.
But yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us today and coming here. I was wondering, so in one of your categorizations of fascism, you kind of like swayed it from demagoguery.
In Eric Posner's particular sense. Not Eric Posner.
Because there's also like, there's that third kind of party of involvement, which is like these cultural elites. And, especially now, like in our modern, politics and times, we see that, the rise of fascism is mainly by uneducated people without degrees. And, do you think that there's some responsibility that kind of they feel like, they're being kind of marginalized by, these kind of elitist institutions? And then, like, in addition to that, kind of, what kind of, like, where in your work, like, how to communicate to these people, kind of would you want to mend that bridge to make them,
Remember when Trump said, I love the uneducated, the poorly educated. I think there's legitimate cause. One of the things that I do in 2016, when I was teaching propaganda, ideology, and democracy, we were reading Elizabeth Hinton's magnificent work. She's now my colleague, I'm proud to say. From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, the making of mass incarceration in America. And she begins with the Johnson-era liberal programs, which were supposed to help black Americans in urban areas, poor black Americans in urban areas. Did they offer them jobs? No. They said, we'll give you job training, we'll train you how to be at an interview, we'll give you all this job training so you can go and get jobs. But there weren't any jobs. And they were saying, but what do those essentially welfare programs do? They told them, you're not good enough now for jobs. We're going to train you to act white or whatever and train you for jobs that don't exist. Did Trump do that when he went to rallies in middle America? Did he say, we're going to train you for jobs that don't exist? No, he said, I'm going to bring back manufacturing. I'm going to give dignity to people with high school educations. He didn't. He never intended to. But he said, he put cultural centrality to jobs that didn't require high education. Ultimately, what you would want, and this is, I suppose, I know that what the Biden administration is thinking, give a lot of jobs, building bridges and stuff. The New Deal worked like this. Give people who don't, reduce the culture, the need for, address the material needs of people who don't have a college education. And then you're going to get many fewer fascists. And don't make people who don't have give them union jobs at Ford, middle-class salaries, a pickup truck, a boat that a Ford worker used to be able to have. And Trump actually said that. He's like, he didn't say, I'm going to train you to act, Clinton actually made the mistake of saying, I'm going to train you to be tech workers. So I would say give some dignity to jobs that don't require education. And the other thing is, of course, fascism is a fight about the public schools. That's what we're seeing. So you got to defend the schools because they want to change the education. If people don't know about the Jim Crow, about the fact that elections, they've always said black Americans were corrupt and not worthy of, couldn't democratically participate because they'd be corrupt. They've always said that. That is part of Jim Crow. So if you don't teach that, then you can do the same thing now. So public schools need to be defended.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time. I wanted to ask, given where we're at politically and culturally as a country, and with how successful the far-right movements have been in this country, do you think that the United States will fall to fascism within our lifetimes? And if so, how long do we have?
So I think, first of all, the young people, there's a lot of generational stuff going on. I think there are young, very far-right radicals, and you young people probably know that, which I don't think there were, certainly not as many. Even the far-right Republican youth groups are attacking each other for, you won't allow white supremacists. Different structures ideologically are arising. We're finding an ultra-nationalism that's unifying black right-wing men usually and white right-wing men. So it's kind of more classical nationalist fascism. We're Americans, Christian nationalism. But we've always fought these forces. There are black Americans who have typically led the fore in getting us away from them. What we're seeing, what you guys are experiencing is also very similar to what we've always experienced as Americans. So it's always been the case. It's always been the case that there was police violence followed by large-scale black political rebellion, followed by people agreeing they're going to change things so it won't happen again, followed by a white backlash, followed by it gets worse than ever. And it was in the 60s in thousands of different cities, documented in Elizabeth Hinton's book, America on Fire. Rodney King in 1992, 2015 every year, right? So in one sense, is it, we've always fought these forces. The young people, it's, don't think things are like that. Reconstruction was 10 years where black Americans could vote in the South, and then it ended and they couldn't vote again for almost a century. So history works like that. But you guys have agency. You're the young people. So there is no prediction here because it depends on what we do, right? So to make any kind of prediction would be to rob us of the necessary agency. So there is no prediction. Just what are we going to do?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So you mentioned a couple times the way fascists attack art and culture as both the elite and also by shutting down any art and culture that is against them. And I was wondering if you think there is any merit to the idea of sort of cultivating a more artistic and more culturally inclined and culturally, I guess, literate society in fighting fascism.
Absolutely. You need to center the arts. You need to center the, art is way marginalized forces represent their identities. And so, you need that's why every single fascist social and political movement says, no, this is going to be the art now. It sounds like landscape painting or, so.
Something boring.
So you have to fight that because the sort of like self-expression of art is a core freedom, a core form of freedom. And, that's why fascists always focus on art as degenerate and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll take two more questions of people who are in line, and then we'll move to informal discussion.
Hello again. In a previous answer to a question, you mentioned how re-education camps existed only because they were seen as a means of redeeming the people who were subject to them.
Well, redeeming. I mean,
quote unquote redeeming.
Giving them, pretending like they could be redeemed.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask how you would relate that to Foucault's descriptions of power and how he would view these camps as these drives to improve people as another form of putting power over them.
Good. Right. I mean, Foucault's in a sense saying that's what the prison does in the West, right? The prison is a re-education camp. That's a great point. The prison is, pure, and fascists, you can think of the death camp as, that's something that that works by domination, right? It doesn't work by re-education. So Foucault's distinction in part 4 of Discipline and Punish, when he says, look, it used to be you could just torture, you break them on the rack, you skin them alive, but they could scream all they want about how they hated you. You weren't trying to change their minds. You were trying to make them suffer as much as possible. But the prison tries to make you, to create better human beings, and it does so in these brutal ways that also, weirdly, also involve torture. But it's this, right, so absolutely, I mean, good point. Like, it's not just, Mao and Stalin, it's also the American prison, or the prison.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for your time. A few questions ago, you answered by saying that it would be pretty much not the greatest thing to try and make predictions about what direction the United States is going to be going into with regards to whether we will fall to fascism and stuff like that, because it depends on what we do. So I suppose my question is, what can we do? I feel like a lot of people have...
That is the question,
yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Well, what we can do is help people vote. Think of what they did in the 60s. People went to the South. I mean, if I were going to do the civil rights movement, I'd do it in Vermont or a state like, I wouldn't do it in Alabama. It would still be scary to do the civil rights movement in that, But, be prepared to go out on the street. If there's not a good record right now of this. I hate to say, if you look at East, if you look at Belarus, if you look at but, you know, what's going to happen if the elections, if essentially they seize the election via these authoritarian means? You know, we faced it like with Bush v. Gore, this weird thing, but it was unclear. You know, right now, I mean, we almost had a coup. Would we have gone back to being upset for 3 weeks, then just gone back to the regular structures of life? Don't do that. Make ordinary life stop if that happens. That's what you have to do if you want to preserve democracy.
Before I ask us to thank Jason again, I want to tell you what to do. I'm gonna try to channel Noam Chomsky because he gets asked this at every talk he gives. There are lots and lots of organizations that you can join forces with. You can't do everything, but you can do one thing. And so I would suggest for students and members of the UMass community to go to the list of registered student associations that you can find on the UMass website through Student Life. I know there are a number of student groups on a variety of the issues that Jason has raised. For the community, Mass Peace Action, the group that we're partnering with for the Saturday event, has a fabulous website and will give you lots of information about local goings-on. You can also subscribe to the Trap Rock newsletter, which has a comprehensive calendar that comes out every couple of weeks with all the events sponsored by local groups on a variety of issues concerned with peace and justice. But now I'd like us all to thank Jason very much for a really provocative and interesting